The ticking wasn't coming from the old grandfather clock in the hallway, and it wasn't coming from the watch on my wrist. It was coming from inside the air vent directly above my head, a rhythmic, metallic snap that happened exactly every 4 seconds. I lay perfectly still in my bed, my eyes fixed on the dark slats of the vent. Most people would have thought it was the house settling or a loose pipe, but I had spent 34 years in the army as a master bomb disposal technician. I had spent my life listening to things that ticked, hummed, or hissed in the dark. I knew the sound of a mechanical timer when I heard one. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't reach for the light. I just listened. In the room next to mine, I heard the floorboards groan as my son, Ben, walked toward the vents in the hallway. He stopped, and I heard the faint click of a remote control. The ticking stopped instantly. I heard him let out a long, slow breath, a sound of satisfaction. And then he walked back to his room. That was the moment I realized my own son wasn't just trying to make me think I was losing my mind. He was using my greatest trauma as a weapon against me. He was building a fake bomb to blow up my life. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I am 78 years old, and my hands are still as steady as the day I retired. When you spend 3 decades cutting wires that can turn a city block into a crater, you learn how to control your heart. You learn how to breathe so slowly that your chest barely moves. You learn that panic is the thing that kills you, not the explosives. After I left the service, I moved to this quiet farmhouse in the hills. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where the only things that made noise were the crickets and the wind in the trees. For a long time, it was. Then my son, Ben, came back. He had lost his job in the city, he had lost his apartment, and he had lost a lot of money on things he wouldn't tell me about. I opened my door to him because he was my blood. I thought he needed a home. I didn't realize he looked at my home and only saw the dollar signs of the land it sat on. The episodes started about 3 weeks after he arrived. It began with small things that felt like ghosts. I would go to the kitchen to make my morning coffee, and I would find a kitchen timer hidden behind the toaster, set to go off in 5 minutes. When it would ding, Ben would come running in, looking at me with a face full of fake pity. "Dad, why did you set the timer again?" he would ask. I would tell him I didn't set it, and he would sigh, that long, tired sigh that people use when they think they are dealing with a child. "You're getting confused, Dad. It's okay. We'll just have to keep an eye on things." He started talking about cognitive decline and safety risks. He started calling doctors behind my back, using words like paranoid and unstable. He wanted the world to think that the old bomb tech was finally seeing shadows that weren't there. He knew my history. He knew about the night in Baghdad when a pressure plate had taken my best friend's legs. He knew that I checked the doors 3 times every night and that I couldn't stand the sound of a sudden loud pop. He was using that knowledge to paint a picture of a man who was dangerous to himself. If he could prove I was mentally unfit, he would become my legal guardian. He would get the power to sell this land to the developers who had been calling me for years. They wanted to turn my hills into a luxury golf course, and they were offering millions. I had always said no. Ben wanted to say yes. I lay there in the dark after the ticking stopped, my mind working like a computer. I didn't get angry. Anger is a distraction. In the EOD world, we have a saying: first, you see the threat. Second, you study the trigger. Third, you cut the connection. Ben was the threat. The gaslighting was the trigger. Now, I needed to find a way to cut the connection without him even knowing I was awake. I knew he was watching me. He had installed security cameras in the house for my safety, but I knew they were there so he could record me looking for things that didn't exist. He wanted video evidence of me tearing apart the vents or looking under the floorboards for bombs. The next morning, I came down to breakfast and acted like I didn't remember the night before. I let my hand shake a little as I picked up my orange juice. I let my eyes wander around the room as if I were looking for something I had lost. Ben was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and gave me a bright, fake smile. "Morning, Dad. Did you sleep okay? I thought I heard you walking around last night." I looked at him and forced a confused frown. "Did I? I don't remember, Ben. I thought I heard a bird. Or maybe a clock." Ben's eyes narrowed just a tiny bit. He was looking for the fear. I didn't give it to him. "Just a bird, Dad," he said, turning back to his phone. "Don't worry about it. I've got Dr. Lawson coming by this afternoon just to do a quick checkup. You know, for your blood pressure." I knew Dr. Lawson. He was a young man who had been out of medical school for about 5 minutes. He was the kind of doctor who looked at an old man and only saw a collection of symptoms, not a person. Ben had been feeding him stories for weeks. I knew that today's checkup wasn't about my blood pressure. It was about my mind. If I failed whatever test they had planned, I might not be sleeping in my own bed tonight. I needed to move fast. I needed to show Ben that I wasn't the one who was out of his depth. I spent the morning in the workshop behind the house. It's my favorite place in the world. It smells like sawdust, oil, and old metal. Ben never goes in there because he says it's messy. To me, it is the most organized place on earth. Every tool has a place. Every screw is sorted. I sat at my workbench and pulled out an old radio. I started taking it apart, my fingers moving with the muscle memory of a lifetime of work. I wasn't just fixing a radio. I was building a sensor. If Ben was using remote-controlled devices to trigger sounds and lights in the house, he was using a specific radio frequency. I needed to find that frequency. I needed to know when the trap was being set before it went off. As I worked, I thought about the bridge. In 1985, I was sent to a bridge in a place I can't name. There was a device attached to the main support beam. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, a mercury switch, a tripwire, and a light sensor all tied together. If the bridge moved, it went off. If someone walked past it, it went off. If the sun came up, it went off. I spent 6 hours under that bridge with the water rushing below me, my heart beating so slow it felt like it had stopped. I survived that bridge because I understood the logic of the man who built it. I understood his hate, and I understood his mistakes. Ben was building a psychological bridge. He wanted me to fall off. But he didn't have the discipline of a real bomb maker. He was sloppy. He was leaving a trail. By noon, my sensor was done. It was small enough to fit in the pocket of my cardigan. It would vibrate against my hip whenever a radio signal was sent nearby. I walked back into the house just as Ben was clearing the lunch dishes. He looked at me with that suspicious look he always had. "What were you doing out there, Dad? You were out there a long time." I gave him a vacant smile. "Just looking for my hammer, Ben. I think I left it in the garden. Or maybe the shed. I can't seem to find it." Ben sighed and shook his head. "I'll find it for you later, Dad. Why don't you go sit in the living room? Dr. Lawson will be here any minute." I sat in my chair and waited. My hips started to vibrate. A small, rhythmic pulse. Ben was in the kitchen, and he was sending a signal. Suddenly, the television in the living room turned on by itself. The volume was at maximum, and it was playing a recording of a loud, high-pitched whistle, the exact sound of an incoming mortar round. I didn't flinch. I didn't jump. I just reached for the remote on the side table and turned it off. Ben came running in, acting panicked. "Dad! What happened? Why was the TV so loud?" I looked at him and tilted my head. "The TV? It wasn't on, Ben. I'm just sitting here waiting for the doctor." Ben froze. He looked at the TV, then at me. He knew he had turned it on. He knew the sound had been deafening. But I was sitting there as if the room had been silent. I saw the first flicker of real doubt in his eyes. He thought he was gaslighting me, but I had just flipped the script. I was making him doubt his own eyes. If he told the doctor I didn't hear a loud noise, and the doctor didn't hear it either because the signal was off, it made Ben look like the one who was hearing things. It was a small win, but in a bomb disposal, you win 1 inch at a time. Dr. Lawson arrived at 2 p.m. He was carrying a briefcase and wearing a suit that was too expensive for a country doctor. He sat across from me and started asking the usual questions. What day is it? Who is the president? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? I answered every question perfectly. I was clear, I was focused, and I was polite. I saw Ben standing in the doorway, his face getting tighter and tighter. He couldn't understand why I was suddenly so sharp. He started to interrupt. Doctor, he's having a good day today, but last night he was talking to the walls. He thought he heard clicking in the vents. He was terrified. Dr. Lawson looked at me. Is that true, Arthur? Were you hearing noises last night? I smiled softly. I think Ben is just worried about me, doctor. He's been through a lot of stress lately with his job. Sometimes I think he hears the old house settling and he gets scared for me. He's a good son. Maybe too good. I think he's the one who needs a checkup. He's been telling me he sees things that aren't there. I looked at Ben then, a long, steady look. Ben's eye gave a tiny twitch. He was furious, but he couldn't show it in front of the doctor. The doctor looked back and forth between us. He was starting to see a different pattern. He saw an old man who was calm and collected, and a young man who was sweating and jumping at every shadow. Well, Dr. Lawson said, closing his briefcase. Arthur seems perfectly fine to me. His memory is better than mine. Ben, maybe we should talk about your stress levels. It's hard taking care of an elderly parent, and sometimes the mind plays tricks when we're tired. Ben looked like he wanted to scream. He forced a laugh. Yeah, maybe you're right, doctor. I've been working really hard. After the doctor left, the atmosphere in the house changed. It went from a fake concern to a cold, hard war. Ben didn't talk to me for the rest of the afternoon. He stayed in his room, and I could hear him pacing. My sensor kept vibrating. He was testing his devices. He was trying to figure out what went wrong. I stayed in the living room, reading a book, but I wasn't reading. I was mapping the house in my head. I knew where every vent was. I knew where every wire ran. I knew where the main charge would be hidden. Because I knew Ben. He wouldn't stop with small noises. He was getting desperate. He needed a big event to prove I was crazy. That evening, I went to the kitchen to make dinner. I like to cook, it's like chemistry. Everything has to be exact. As I was standing at the stove, I felt the sensor on my hip go off with a long, continuous vibration. It didn't stop. It was a steady signal. I looked at the microwave. The digital display was counting down from 10 minutes. It wasn't cooking anything. It was just counting. I looked out the window and saw Ben standing by the old oak tree in the yard. He was holding his phone, watching the house. He was waiting for something to happen. I didn't wait for the countdown. I turned off the stove and walked down to the basement. The basement is where the old furnace is, and it's where all the gas lines come into the house. If I were going to create a big event that looked like an accident caused by a forgetful old man, that's where I would do it. I moved quietly, my old knees not making a sound on the stairs. I reached the bottom and didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I could smell it. The faint, sweet smell of natural gas. Ben had loosened the coupling on the main line. It wasn't enough to blow the house up yet, but it was enough to fill the basement with a dangerous cloud. He had also rigged a small sparking device near the pilot light of the water heater. It was a simple setup, a remote trigger that would create a spark when he pushed a button. He wanted me to come down here, smell the gas, panic, and then he would trigger the spark. He wouldn't kill me. He just wanted a small fire, something he could rescue me from and then tell the world I had left the gas on. I looked at the sparking device. It was a cheap toy, a modified igniter from a grill. I could have disabled it in 5 seconds, but I didn't. I had a better idea. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small roll of electrical tape and a piece of wire I had taken from the radio. I didn't stop the spark. I redirected it. I moved the igniter away from the gas line and attached it to a metal pipe that led back up to the kitchen. Then, I tightened the gas coupling so the leak stopped. I opened the basement window to let the gas out. I went back upstairs and sat at the kitchen table. I waited. I saw Ben through the window. He looked at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He was counting down the seconds in his head. I picked up my newspaper and started reading. I saw him press the button. A loud crack echoed through the kitchen. It wasn't an explosion, it was just the sound of a high-voltage spark hitting the metal pipe behind the refrigerator. It sounded like a gunshot. Ben came running into the house, his face white. "Dad! What was that? Did something blow up?" I looked at him and didn't move. "What was what, Ben?" "I didn't hear anything. I think you're having another one of your episodes. You should really go lie down." Ben was shaking now. He ran to the basement door and sniffed the air. There was no smell of gas. He ran to the kitchen and looked behind the fridge, but there was nothing to see. He was losing his grip on reality because the reality he was trying to create kept disappearing. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of real fear in his eyes. He didn't see a confused old man anymore. He saw a shadow. He saw the master bomb tech. "You're doing this," he whispered. "How are you doing this?" I didn't answer. I just turned the page of my newspaper. "I don't know what you're talking about, son. Maybe you should call Dr. Lawson back. I'm worried about you." Ben backed away from me, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He went to his room and slammed the door. I sat there for a long time, the house silent around me. I knew this was just the beginning. Ben was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. He would try one more thing. Something bigger. Something he couldn't take back. I looked at the clock. 9 p.m. The final phase of the operation was starting. I got up and went to my workshop. I had work to do. I needed to build something that would end this once and for all. I spent the next 4 hours working under the glow of a single lamp. I wasn't building a bomb. I was building a mirror. I was building a device that would capture everything Ben did and play it back to him in a way he couldn't deny. I used the parts from the old radio, a small camera from my wildlife kit, and a voice recorder. It was a simple, black box. I would hide it in the one place Ben thought was safe. As I worked, I thought about the first time I held Ben. He was so small, so perfect. I remember thinking that I would do anything to keep him safe. I spent my whole career facing death so he could grow up in a world where he didn't have to worry about things that ticked in the dark. It broke my heart to see what he had become. But a bomb tech knows that sometimes, you have to destroy a part of something to save the rest. I had to destroy his lie to save our family. I finished the box at 1 a.m. I walked back into the house, moving like a ghost. I went to the hallway and looked at the vent where I had heard the ticking. I reached up, unscrewed the grate, and looked inside. There it was. A small, black box with a timer. It was a fake, just like I thought. It was meant to make noise, not to explode. I left it there. I didn't want him to know I had found it. Instead, I placed my own black box right next to it. My box would record every time his device was triggered. It would record the radio signal, the sound, and the time. It would be the evidence that no doctor or judge could ignore. I went back to my room and lay down. I didn't sleep. I waited for the morning. I knew that tomorrow was the day the developers were coming to sign the final offer. Ben thought he would have me committed by then. He thought he would be the one holding the pen. He didn't know that I was the one who had already set the timer. The sun started to come up, painting the hills in shades of orange and red. It was a beautiful morning. The birds started to sing, and for a moment, the house felt like a home again. But then I heard the floorboards groan in the next room. I heard the click of the remote. The ticking started again. Snap. 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 I got out of bed and dressed slowly. I put on my best shirt and my old army jacket. I wanted to look like the man I was. I walked into the kitchen and found Ben already there. He looked terrible. His eyes were red, and his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't hold his coffee cup. He looked at me and didn't say anything. The ticking was still going on in the hallway, louder than before. "Do you hear that, Ben?" I asked softly. Ben stared at me. "Hear what, Dad?" "I don't hear anything." "The ticking," I said. "It's coming from the vent. It sounds like an old fuse. The kind we used to find in the desert. It's a very dangerous sound, Ben. If I were you, I'd be very careful." Ben's face went pale. He tried to laugh. "Dad, you're just tired. There's no ticking. You're imagining it again." "Am I?" I walked over to the hallway and pointed at the vent. "Because I think the police will hear it. And I think the men who are coming to buy the land will hear it. And I think they'll wonder why my son is trying to blow up his own father." Ben stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You don't have any proof. Nobody will believe you. You're an old, crazy man." "I have the box, Ben," I said. "Not your box. Mine." Ben froze. He looked at the vent, then at me. He realized then that the game was over. He realized that he had been playing against a master, and he had lost. He turned and ran for the front door, but he didn't get far. Because at that moment, the driveway was filled with the sound of sirens. I had made one more call the night before. I had called my old friend from the service, the one who worked for the state police. I told him I had found something suspicious in my house. I told him I needed a professional to come and take a look. The police arrived just as the developers pulled into the driveway. It was a crowded scene. I stood on the porch and watched as the officers went into the house. I watched as they pulled the fake device out of the vent. And I watched as they pulled out my black box. Ben was sitting on the grass, his head in his hands. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was just broken. I walked down the steps and stood over him. I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. "The connection is cut, Ben," I said. I looked at the developers, who were looking at the scene with wide eyes. They realized that this wasn't a piece of land they wanted to touch. They turned their cars around and drove away without saying a word. The land was safe. The house was safe. But the family was gone. The police took the devices as evidence. They took Ben's statement, and they took mine. They told me that what Ben had done was a crime, a serious one. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the boy who had tried to steal my soul. "I just want him to get help," I said. "And I want him to leave my house." Ben was led away in a patrol car. He didn't look back. I stood in the driveway until the sirens faded away. The hills were quiet again. The crickets were singing, and the wind was blowing through the trees. I walked back into the house and sat in my chair. It was 10 a.m. I looked at the vent in the hallway. It was empty now. No ticking. No snapping. No fake ghosts. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my sensor. I turned it off and put it on the table. I didn't need it anymore. I am Arthur Penhaligon. I am 78 years old. I am a master bomb tech, and I am the master of my own home. The threat has been removed. The fuse has been pulled. And for the first time in a long time, the silence is beautiful. But as I sat there, I realized that the house felt too big. It felt too empty. I had won the war, but I had lost the thing I was fighting for. I had saved the land, but I had lost my son. I looked at the old radio on my workbench, still in pieces. I realized that some things can be fixed, and some things are just broken forever. I got up and went to the workshop. I picked up a screwdriver and started to put the radio back together. I worked slowly, carefully, one piece at a time. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing: as long as my hands were steady, I would keep building. I would keep listening. And I would never let the darkness win. The sun climbed higher in the sky, filling the workshop with light. I felt the weight of the years on my shoulders, but I also felt a sense of pride. I had survived. I had protected what was mine. And as the radio finally sparked to life, playing a soft, clear song, I knew that I was going to be okay. The captain was still on duty, and the perimeter was secure. The silence in the house after Ben was taken away was not the peaceful kind of silence I had hoped for. It was a heavy, thick silence that felt like a fog. I spent the first few days moving through the rooms like a man walking through water. I cleaned up the mess the police had made, and I put the vent covers back on. I swept the floors and washed the dishes. But every time I passed the hallway, I found myself stopping to listen. I was listening for that ticking sound, even though I knew the device was gone. I was listening for Ben's footsteps, even though I knew he was in a cell 40 miles away. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next thing to happen. In my line of work, we call this the soak time. It's the period right after an explosion or a disarm when you wait to see if there is a secondary device. You never assume the area is clear just because the first threat is gone. You wait, you watch, and you keep your head down. I found the first clue that the game wasn't over on a Tuesday morning. I was in Ben's old room, packing up the last of his clothes into cardboard boxes. I wanted everything out. I wanted the room to be empty so I could breathe again. I reached under the bed to check for any stray socks, and my hand hit something hard and cold. It wasn't a toy or a piece of tech. It was a metal lockbox, the kind people use to keep extra cash or important papers. It was small, painted a dull gray, and it was locked. I pulled it out and sat on the floor with it. My heart started to beat a little faster. This wasn't one of Ben's cheap tricks. This was something he had been hiding very carefully. I didn't have the key, but a man who spent 30 years opening things that didn't want to be opened doesn't need a key. I took it out to my workshop and used a thin piece of spring steel to feel the tumblers. It took me less than a minute. The lid popped open with a soft click. Inside the box, there were no bombs. There were no wires. There were only papers. But as I started to read them, I realized these papers were more dangerous than any explosive I had ever handled. They were loan documents, but they weren't from a bank. They were handwritten notes on yellow legal pads, signed by Ben and a man named Vinny. The interest rates were impossible, 20% every week. There were photos, too. Photos of my house, photos of my land, and even photos of me sitting on my porch. On the back of one photo of me, someone had written, "The old man is the only thing in the way. Move him or we move you." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Ben wasn't just trying to steal my land because he was greedy. He was trying to steal it because he was terrified. He had gotten into debt with people who didn't care about family or aging fathers. He was a man drowning in a stormy sea, and he had tried to climb on top of me to keep his own head above water. I sat there in my workshop for a long time, looking at those papers. I felt a sudden wave of guilt. I had been so focused on winning the war against my son that I hadn't seen the shadows behind him. He was still a liar, and he was still a thief, but he was also a victim of his own bad choices. And now, those bad choices were coming for me. I looked at the date on the last note. It was from 2 weeks ago. The note said, "Deadline is the 20th. No more excuses." Today was the 18th. The developers who had come to the house weren't just random businessmen. They were likely the front for these people. When they drove away after the police arrived, they didn't just give up. They went back to report that the plan had failed. And in that world, a failed plan meant someone had to pay. I walked back to the house and looked out the kitchen window. The hills were quiet, but I didn't trust the quiet anymore. I went to my bedroom and pulled a heavy wooden box from the top shelf of my closet. Inside was my old service pistol. I hadn't cleaned it in 5 years, but I knew it would work. I sat at the kitchen table and started to take it apart. I cleaned every part with oil and a soft cloth. I checked the springs and the barrel. I loaded the magazine with steady hands. I wasn't an old man anymore. I was a soldier again. I was preparing for a siege. I knew they would come. They had invested too much time in Ben to walk away now. They wanted the land, and they knew that son was out of the picture. That left only the bold man. The first sign of trouble came that evening. A black SUV drove slowly past the front of my property. It didn't stop, but it didn't speed up either. It just rolled past, the dark windows reflecting the setting sun. I stood behind the curtain in the living room and watched it go. 5 minutes later, it came back the other way. They were scouting the perimeter. They were looking for cameras, for dogs, for any signs of life. I didn't turn on the lights. I stayed in the shadows. I had spent years learning how to be invisible in a war zone, and I brought all of that back into my mind. I moved my chair away from the window. I checked the locks on every door, but I didn't just lock them. I rigged them. I took some thin fishing line and some old bells from my fishing kit. I tied them to the door handles and the window frames. If anything moved, I would know. That night, the phone rang. I didn't answer it. The caller ID said, "Private." It rang 10 times, stopped, and then rang again. On the third time, I picked up but I didn't say anything. I just listened. On the other end, there was only the sound of breathing and a faint hum of traffic. "I know you're there, Arthur," a voice said. It was a smooth voice, like oil on water. It didn't sound angry or mean. It sounded bored. "Ben told us you were a tough old guy. He told us you were smart. But Ben is gone, and he still owes us a lot of money. The land is the payment. You sign the papers, and we all go home happy. You don't sign, and things get complicated. We'll be there tomorrow morning to collect. Think about it." The line went dead. I didn't sleep. I spent the night in the workshop. I needed to build things. If these people were coming to my house, they were expecting an easy win. They were expecting a 78-year-old man who would be scared and confused. They weren't expecting a master bomb tech. I didn't build anything that would kill anyone. I wasn't a murderer, but I built things that would make them wish they had never stepped onto my grass. I used old firecrackers, some high-powered flashlights, and a few motion sensors I had for the garden. I spent the hours before dawn setting up my welcome party. I put sensors in the tall grass by the driveway. I rigged the gate to trigger a loud, shrieking alarm. I even set up a series of bright floodlights that would blind anyone coming up the porch stairs. As the sun began to peek over the hills, I went back inside and made a pot of strong black coffee. I sat in my favorite chair with my pistol on the side table and the papers from Ben's lockbox in front of me. I felt a strange sense of calm. This was what I was trained for. This was the work. I waited. At exactly 8 a.m., the black SUV came back. This time, it didn't drive past. It turned into my driveway and stopped at the gate. 3 men got out. They were all wearing suits, but they didn't look like businessmen. They looked like they were made of stone. They looked at the gate, then at the house. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, walked up to the gate and tried to push it open. The second his hand touched the metal, the alarm went off. It wasn't just a bell, it was a high-pitched, screaming siren that echoed off the hills. The men jumped back, clutching their ears. I didn't move. I just watched from the window. The tall man looked angry now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of wire cutters. He snipped the chain on the gate and pushed it open. As the 3 of them started walking up the long driveway, they stepped over the first sensor. Immediately, a series of small bangs went off in the grass around them. They were just heavy-duty firecrackers I had buried in metal cans, but in the morning quiet, they sounded like gunshots. The men dived for the ground, pulling out their own weapons. They were terrified. They thought they were under fire. I picked up the megaphone I had used for town meetings and stepped onto the porch. "That's far enough," I shouted. My voice was loud and clear. The men stayed low in the grass, looking up at me. "You're trespassing. The police have been notified, and the next things that go off won't be firecrackers. Leave the property now." The tall man stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off his suit. He looked at me with a look of pure hate. "You think you're funny, old man? You think these toys are going to stop us? We're coming in there, and when we do, you're going to wish you had just signed the papers." He started walking again, his eyes fixed on me. He was trying to act tough, but I could see his hands shaking. He wasn't used to people fighting back. I waited until they were 20 feet from the porch. "Last warning," I said. They didn't stop. I hit the switch on the floodlights. Even in the daylight, the 5,000 lumen LEDs were blinding. The men stumbled, covering their eyes. While they were distracted, I triggered the secondary device. It was a simple high-pressure garden hose rigged to a motion sensor, but I had mixed a bottle of skunk-scented hunting oil into the tank. A thick, stinking mist sprayed over the 3 of them. They began to gag and cough, the smell so foul it was like a physical wall. They backed away, tripping over each other as they tried to get away from the scent. It was a ridiculous sight. 3 tough guys in suits being defeated by a garden hose and some bad smells, but it worked. They ran back to their SUV, their shoes slipping on the gravel. They didn't leave, though. They sat in the car at the end of the driveway, windows rolled down, trying to get the smell out. I went back inside and sat down. I knew this was just a pause. They were calling for backup, or they were coming up with a more violent plan. I looked at the phone. It was ringing again. I picked it up. "That was a mistake, Arthur," the oily voice said. He sounded angry now. "You think you can embarrass my men? You think you can play games with me? Now it's not about the land. Now it's about making sure you never walk again. We're coming back with more people. We're going to burn that house to the ground with you inside it." I didn't answer. I just hung up. I knew I couldn't stay in the house if they were going to use fire. I had to move. But I also knew I couldn't leave the property. If I left, they would win. I had to take the fight to them. I went to the basement and grabbed my old tactical vest. I put it on, feeling the weight of the pockets. I loaded up on more sensors, more distractions, and my pistol. I slipped out the back door and moved into the tall grass of the hills. I knew every inch of this land. I knew where the shadows stayed the longest and where the ground was soft. I moved like a ghost, circling around the back of the SUV. I watched them from the cover of a large rock. There were 4 men now. A second car had arrived. They were standing by the SUV, talking and pointing at the house. They had a can of gasoline and a crowbar. They were getting ready to rush the front door. I looked at the tires of their cars. I could have slashed them, but that would just trap them here. I wanted them gone. I wanted them to be so scared that they would never come back. I reached into my vest and pulled out a small device I had made. It was a sonic emitter, a little box that played a sound at a frequency that makes people feel intense anxiety and physical illness. It's a trick I learned in the service. It's not a weapon, but it's a powerful psychological tool. I crawled closer, inch by inch, until I was just 10 feet away from their cars, hidden by a thick bush. I turned on the emitter. Within seconds, the men stopped talking. They started to look around, their faces turning pale. One of them clutched his stomach. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. I feel like I'm going to die. Something is wrong here." The tall man tried to stay calm. "It's just the old man's tricks. Ignore it. Let's get to the house." But they couldn't ignore it. The sound was vibrating in their ears, making their brains feel like they were being squeezed. They started to argue. They were losing their nerve. This was the human element of bomb disposal. You don't just deal with the machine, you deal with the person who is trying to stop you. If you break their focus, you win. I stood up from the bush, my pistol held low but visible. "The police are 3 minutes away." I lied. My voice was deep and steady, the voice of a man who was in total control. "I have recorded your faces, your license plates, and your threats. If you don't leave this property in the next 60 seconds, I will trigger the underground charges. You are standing on 5 gallons of liquid explosive. Do you want to see what happens?" I wasn't standing on anything but dirt, but they didn't know that. They looked at the ground, then at me. They saw an old man in a tactical vest, looking like he was ready to go to war. They saw a man who had nothing to lose and 30 years of experience in making things blow up. The tall man looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He realized he wasn't dealing with a victim. He was dealing with a predator. He was out of his league. "Let's go," he muttered to the others. "This isn't worth it. The old man is crazy. Let's just go." They scrambled into their cars, tires screaming as they backed out of the driveway. They didn't look back. They flew down the road, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. I stood there until the sound of their engines faded away. I stayed in the tall grass for another hour, just in case. But they didn't come back. They were gone. I walked back to the house, my boots heavy on the gravel. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. I had defended my home. I had faced the monsters and I had won. But as I walked through the front door, the silence hit me again. The fog was still there. I went to the kitchen and looked at the papers on the table. The land was safe, but the cost was high. I thought about Ben, sitting in his cell, probably wondering if these men were going to find him. I realized that as long as Ben was in debt, I would never truly be safe. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a different front. I had to find a way to clear Ben's name, not for his sake, but for mine. I had to finish the job. I sat down at the table and picked up the phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my lawyer. I called the number on the yellow legal pad. The oily voice answered on the first ring. "What now, Arthur? 'You want to tell me you're sorry?' I took a deep breath. "No," I said. "I want to make a deal. I have the records of every payment Ben made to you. I have the names of the people you used to front your real estate deals. And I have a friend in the state police who is very interested in organized crime. You leave my son alone, and you leave my land alone, and I might forget to give him the folder I've been putting together for the last 30 years. There was a long silence on the other end. I could feel the man thinking. He was a businessman, and he knew when a deal had gone bad. He knew that an old army tech with nothing to lose was the most dangerous person in the world. Fine, he said at last. The debt is settled. Ben is off the hook. We won't be back. But Arthur. Don't ever call this number again. He hung up. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying. I had cut the final wire. The device was disarmed. I walked out to my porch and sat in my rocking chair. The sun was high in the sky now, and the hills looked peaceful. The crickets were singing, and for the first time in weeks, the sound didn't make me jump. But then, I heard a sound from inside the house. A soft, rhythmic clicking. It was coming from the hallway. My heart stopped. I stood up, my hand going to my pistol. I walked into the house, my breath shallow. I followed the sound to the vent. I reached up and pulled off the grate. There, tucked deep inside the metal duct, was a small, black box I hadn't seen before. It was ticking. But it wasn't a fake. I could see the wires, the battery, and the block of gray putty. It was a real explosive. Ben hadn't just left a fake device to scare me. He had left a real one as a backup plan, in case the gaslighting didn't work. Or maybe the men in the suits had put it there while I was in the workshop. It didn't matter who put it there. What mattered was that it was live, and the timer was counting down. I looked at the digital display. 5 minutes. My hands didn't shake. I felt a strange sense of focus. This was it. The final test. I didn't have my tools. I didn't have a bomb suit. I only had my hands and my brain. I reached into the vent and carefully pulled the device toward me. It was a simple circuit, but it was designed to be difficult to reach. I laid it on the floor of the hallway. I could hear my own heart beating, but it was slow and steady. I looked at the wires. Red, blue, yellow, and green. It was a classic setup, but I knew there would be a trap. I looked for the mercury switch. I found it tucked under the battery. If I tilted the device too much, it would go off. I had to keep it perfectly level. I reached for my pocket knife. I needed to cut the power, but I had to do it in the right order. If I cut the wrong wire, the backup battery would trigger the detonator. I looked at the timer. 3 minutes. I thought about Ben. I thought about the men in the suits. I realized that this was the result of all the hate and greed that had filled my house. This little box was the physical form of all the lies. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I picked the yellow wire. It felt right. I put the blade of the knife against the plastic. I started to press down. But then, I stopped. I saw a tiny, almost invisible wire tucked behind the yellow one. It was a dummy wire. If I cut it, the circuit would close. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my forehead. I didn't wipe it away. I moved the knife to the blue wire. This was the real one. I knew it. I could feel the logic of the maker. They wanted me to go for the yellow. They wanted me to be overconfident. I looked at the timer. 1 minute. I didn't hesitate this time. I pressed the blade down and sliced through the blue wire. The ticking stopped. The red numbers on the display vanished. The house went silent. I sat there on the floor, the device in front of me, and I started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had stared into the eyes of death and watched it blink first. I was still alive. The house was still standing. I had won the final round. I picked up the device and walked out to the workshop. I took it apart, piece by piece, until it was nothing but a pile of harmless scrap. I felt a sense of closure I had never felt before. I had disarmed the physical bomb, and I had disarmed the psychological one. I was finally free. I went back to the porch and sat down. The world was quiet. The sun was starting to set again, painting the hills in shades of purple and gold. I felt a deep sense of peace. I was an old man, and my life hadn't been easy, but I was still here. I was the master of my own home, and I was the master of my own fate. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind. There was no ticking. There was only the sound of a life well lived. But then, the gate at the bottom of the driveway creaked open. I opened my eyes. A taxi was sitting there. A man got out of the back. He was thin, his clothes were wrinkled, and he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. It was Ben. He had been released. He stood at the gate, looking up at the house. He looked terrified. He didn't know if I would let him in. He didn't know if the men were gone. He didn't know if the bomb had gone off. He stood there, frozen, waiting for a sign. I looked at him, and for a moment, I wanted to tell him to go away. I wanted to keep my peace. But then I remembered the photos in the lockbox. I remembered the man who was drowning. I stood up from my chair and walked to the edge of the porch. I didn't say anything. I just raised my hand and signaled for him to come up. Ben started to walk, slowly at first, then faster. He reached the porch and looked at me, tears in his eyes. "Dad," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at him and felt a strange sense of pity. He was my son, and he was broken. "I know, Ben," I said. "I know everything. The men are gone. The debt is settled. And the house is safe." Ben fell to his knees, sobbing. I put my hand on his shoulder. It was a heavy weight, but I was strong enough to carry it. We went inside, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt like it might actually become a home again. But as I closed the door, I knew that the real work was just beginning. I am Arthur Penhaligon. I am a master bomb tech. I have disarmed the world, and now, I have to find a way to disarm the heart of my son. It will be the hardest job I've ever had, but I'm not going anywhere. The perimeter is secure, the fuse is gone, and the captain is still on duty. We sat in the kitchen, and I started to make a fresh pot of coffee. The silence was still there, but it wasn't a fog anymore. It was a clean slate. It was a new beginning. And as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I knew that we were going to be okay. We had survived the explosion, and now, we were going to build something new from the pieces. Good night, world. The house is safe, and the family is home. The first few days after Ben came home were the quietest days I can remember in all my 78 years. We lived in the same house, but we moved around each other like two ships in a thick fog, careful not to collide. I made the coffee in the morning, and he washed the mugs. I sat on the porch, and he stayed in his room, or he walked the perimeter of the property, looking at the hills with a look I couldn't quite read. He was thin, and he looked like a man who was waiting for the sky to fall on his head. I didn't push him to talk. I knew that when a person has been through a blast, you don't just ask them to stand up and run. You let the ringing in their ears stop first. You let them find their feet. I spent a lot of time in my workshop, but I wasn't building sensors or alarms anymore. I was fixing things. I fixed the old lawnmower that had been coughing for 3 summers. I fixed the loose hinge on the back door. I fixed a wooden chair that had a broken leg. I realized that my whole life had been about stopping things from breaking, but I had never really learned how to put them back together once the damage was done. Disarming a bomb is easy compared to fixing a broken man. A bomb follows the laws of physics and chemistry. A man follows the laws of his own fear, and those laws change every single day. One evening, about a week after he returned, Ben came out to the workshop. He stood in the doorway, the light from the setting sun casting a long shadow across the floor. He watched me work on a small clock for a long time before he spoke. "Why didn't you just let them take me, Dad?" he asked. His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the sound of my screwdriver. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. He looked like the little boy who had once cried because he broke a window with a baseball. "Because you're my son, Ben," I said. "And because I spent 30 years learning that you don't leave a man behind in a danger zone, even if he's the one who walked into it in the first place." Ben walked into the shop and sat on a wooden stool. He picked up a piece of scrap metal and started turning it over in his hands. "I really did think I was doing the right thing at first," he whispered. "I thought if I could just get the money for the land, I could pay everyone off and we could move somewhere nice. Somewhere where you didn't have to worry about the cold or the hills. I thought I was saving us. But then the money ran out, and the people I owed became monsters. And then I became a monster, too." I sat down across from him. "You didn't become a monster, Ben. You just lost your way. You forgot that in this family, we don't take shortcuts through minefields." That was the night the real work started. I decided that Ben didn't need a jail cell, and he didn't need a doctor who only looked at his symptoms. He needed a foundation. He needed to learn the things I had learned in the dirt and the heat of the desert. He needed to learn the code of the tech. I started by giving him a job. I told him we were going to rebuild the old stone wall that ran along the edge of the property. It had been falling down for 20 years, and the rocks were heavy and jagged. It was hard, back-breaking work, but that was the point. When your hands are busy lifting stones, your brain doesn't have as much room to build lies. We spent the next month in the sun. We carried heavy rocks from the creek bed and stacked them, one by one, according to their shape and weight. I taught him how to look for the balance point of a stone. I taught him that you can't rush a wall. If you try to make it go faster by skipping a step, the whole thing will come tumbling down in the first rain. "It's like life, Ben," I told him as we sat in the shade of an oak tree, wiping the sweat from our faces. "If the base isn't solid, nothing you build on top of it will ever stay straight." Ben didn't say much, but I saw his hands getting calloused and his shoulders getting broader. I saw the look in his eyes change from a flicker of panic to a steady flame of focus. But the world outside our hills didn't just stop. One afternoon, while we were working on the wall, a car pulled up to the gate. It wasn't a black SUV this time. It was a dusty old truck, and the man who got out was wearing a sheriff's uniform. It was my old friend, Miller. He walked up to the wall and looked at the work we had done. "Nice wall, Arthur," he said. Then he looked at Ben. He didn't look mean, but he didn't look friendly either. "Ben, I need you to come down to the station. We found some more information about those people you were involved with. We need a formal statement if we're going to keep them behind bars." I felt Ben go stiff next to me. The old fear was back. He looked at me, and I could see him wanting to run. I put my hand on his arm. "It's okay, Ben," I said. "This is part of the work. You have to face the blast if you want to be free of it." Ben took a deep breath, nodded, and walked to the truck. I watched them drive away, and I felt a pang of worry in my chest. I had made a deal with the oily man on the phone, but I knew that deals with people like that were like ice in the summer. They didn't last long. I went back to the house and checked my pistol. I checked my sensors. I felt the old weight of the mission on my shoulders. While Ben was gone, I walked the property. I looked at the hills and the trees, and I thought about the men who wanted to turn this into a golf course. They saw a dollar sign, but I saw the place where I had buried my dog, the place where my wife had planted her first roses, and the place where I had taught Ben how to drive. This land was part of me. It was the only thing I had left of a life that had been spent in war. I realized that I wasn't just protecting the dirt, I was protecting the memories. And as long as I was breathing, I would never let them turn those memories into a game for people with too much money. Ben came back late that night. He looked tired, but he also looked like a weight had been lifted. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me everything. He had told the police about Vinny, about the loans, and about the threats. He had told them about the night he put the device in the vent. He hadn't held anything back. "The sheriff said it's going to be a long road, Dad," Ben said. "They might still charge me with something. But he said that because I came forward, it will be better for me. I think I'm ready for whatever happens." I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in a long time. My son was finally standing his ground. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. It didn't have a return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a map of my property. There was a red X marked right over the house. No words, just the map. It was a message. The men I had scared away weren't gone for good. They were waiting. They were watching. I knew they wouldn't come in the daylight again. They had learned their lesson about my toys. If they were coming, they would come like thieves in the night, and they would come with fire. I didn't tell Ben about the letter. I didn't want to break the peace we had found. But I started to prepare for the final stand. I didn't build any more bombs or alarms. Instead, I built a fire break. I spent 3 days clearing the brush and the tall grass from around the house and the workshop. I made a wide circle of dirt and gravel that fire couldn't jump across. I checked the water pressure in the well and bought extra hoses. I moved the propane tanks to the far side of the shed. I was treating the house like a bunker. If they wanted to burn me out, I was going to make it the hardest job they ever had. Ben helped me, though he didn't know why I was being so careful. "Just a dry summer, Ben," I told him. "Better to be safe." The attack came on a Friday night, during a thunderstorm that didn't bring any rain, just lightning and wind. The wind was howling through the trees, making the whole house groan. I was sitting in the living room with the lights off, watching the shadows. My sensor on the table gave a soft, steady buzz. Someone was at the gate. I looked through my binoculars and saw 2 figures moving through the trees. They weren't wearing suits this time. They were wearing dark clothes and masks. They weren't carrying papers, they were carrying bottles with rags sticking out of them. Molotov cocktails. I woke Ben up. "It's time," I said. His eyes went wide, but he didn't panic. He saw the look on my face and he knew exactly what was happening. "What do I do, Dad?" he asked. I handed him a heavy flashlight and a fire extinguisher. "You stay by the back door. If anything starts to burn, you put it out. Don't go outside unless I tell you. I'm going to handle the perimeter." I stepped out onto the porch, my pistol in its holster and my megaphone in my hand. The wind was whipping my hair, and the lightning flashed, lighting up the yard like a movie screen. "I see you," I shouted into the megaphone. The 2 figures stopped. They were surprised I was awake. "The fire break is finished. Your bottles won't reach the house. If you throw them, you're only burning the grass, and the police are already on their way." I was lying about the police again, but I needed to buy time. One of the men laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He lit the rag on his bottle and threw it. It sailed through the air, a beautiful, terrifying arc of orange flame. It hit the gravel circle I had made and shattered. The fire flared up, but it stayed on the rocks. It had nowhere to go. The other man threw his bottle at the workshop. It hit the side of the building, and for a second, my heart stopped. But I had treated the wood with fire-retardant chemicals the day before. The flames licked the wood but didn't catch. They just sizzled and died. The men looked confused. They had expected the house to go up like a matchstick. They didn't understand that they were fighting a man who knew how to control energy. They started to run toward the house, but I had one last trick. I hit the remote for the garden's lighting system. The real one, not the flashlights. I had rigged the bulbs to pop with a loud bang when they were turned on. Bang! 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 The sounds echoed off the house like gunfire. The men dived for cover, screaming. They thought I was shooting at them. I'm a master bomb tech. I roared over the megaphone. I have rigged this entire yard. Every step you take is a gamble. Do you want to find out what's under your feet? The men looked at the ground, then at each other. The wind knocked another one of their bottles over, and the fire started to spread toward their own feet in the dry grass. They realized they were trapped in a world they didn't understand. They turned and fled, tripping over the rocks and the brush as they ran for the gate. I stood on the porch until their car sped away. I stayed there for a long time, watching the small fires on the gravel circle burn themselves out. Ben came out and stood next to me. He was shaking, but he was holding the fire extinguisher like a shield. We stood there together, the old soldier and his son, watching the night. The storm finally broke, and the rain started to fall, a heavy, soaking rain that washed away the smell of gasoline and smoke. I felt the tension leave my body. I knew, deep in my gut, that they wouldn't be back. I had shown them that this land was a fortress, and I was its commander. The next morning, we called the sheriff. This time, there was real evidence. The broken bottles, the smell of gas, and the footprints. The police found the men 2 towns over. They hadn't been very good at hiding. And when they were caught, they started talking. They talked about Vinny, and they talked about the developers. It turns out that the oily man on the phone was a high-ranking member of a crime family that had been trying to buy up land for years. With Ben's statement and the evidence from the attack, the whole house of cards came falling down. Life didn't become perfect overnight, but it became real. Ben had to go to court, and he had to do a lot of community service. He spent months cleaning up the town park and helping at the local shelter. He worked hard, and he didn't complain. He stayed in his room at my house, but he didn't hide anymore. He helped me with the wall, and we finished it by the end of the summer. It was a beautiful wall, straight, strong, and built to last 100 years. We stood at the end of it one evening, looking at the hills. It's a good wall, Dad, Ben said. The best, I agreed. I'm 79 now. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, and my knees hurt when the weather turns cold. But the house is quiet. There is no ticking in the vents. There are no ghosts in the hallway. Ben is still here, and he's talking about going back to school to become an architect. He wants to build things that are solid and true. I think he'll be good at it. He knows what happens when you try to skip the foundation. He knows how to find the balance point of a stone. I sit on my porch every evening and watch the sun go down. I think about the many years I spent looking for things that were meant to destroy. I think about the wires I cut and the lives I saved. But then I look at my son, sitting on the porch step with a book in his hand, and I realize that the most important thing I ever disarmed wasn't a bomb. It was a cycle of fear and lies. I disarmed the darkness that had tried to swallow my family, and I did it with the only tools that really matter: truth, hard work, and a little bit of luck. The land is safe. The house is a home. And the captain? Well, the captain is finally off duty. I don't need to listen for the snap of a timer or the hum of a remote. I just listen to the wind in the trees and the sound of my son's voice. And as the stars come out over the hills, I know that the perimeter is secure. The mission is over. We are standing on solid ground, and the air is clear. I close my eyes and let the peace of the hills wash over me. Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. As the final light fades from the sky, I feel a deep sense of completion. My life has been a series of explosions and narrow escapes, but it has led me here, to this quiet porch. I am Arthur Penhaligon. I am a father. I am a survivor. And for the first time in my long life, I am not waiting for something to happen. I am just living. The clock on the wall in the hallway ticks, but it's just a clock. The world is at rest. And as I stand up to go inside and have a cup of tea with my son, I know that we have truly, finally, made it home. I am done with the work. The wires are cut. The thread is gone. And the ending to this story is the only one that ever mattered: peace.